November 3, 1948. The sound of Mrs. Mamie Johnson's suitcase hitting the sidewalk echoed through 135th Street like a gunshot that would be heard across Harlem for months. She stood in the drizzling rain, watching her possessions scattered across the wet pavement, while neighbors turned away in shame. At 67, Bumpy Johnson's mother had just been thrown out of the apartment she'd called home for 15 years. The man responsible stood in the doorway, arms crossed, satisfied smile on his face. Theodore Whitman had no idea he'd just sealed his own fate. What made this moment particularly devastating wasn't just the public humiliation. Mrs. Johnson had just returned from her weekly grocery shopping, carrying a small bag of medicines for her arthritis and a loaf of bread she'd planned to share with her neighbor's children. She'd climbed those familiar 4 flights of stairs, fumbling with arthritic fingers for the key she'd carried for 15 years, only to discover the lock had been changed without warning. But what happened next wasn't immediate retaliation or dramatic confrontation. Instead, Bumpy Johnson did something far more dangerous. He waited. And while he waited, he studied. And while he studied, he planned. To understand the weight of that moment, you need to understand what family meant to Bumpy Johnson in 1948. This wasn't just about real estate or money. This was about respect, dignity, and the one person in Harlem who'd never asked him for anything except to stay alive long enough to visit her on Sundays. Mamie Johnson was more than Bumpy's mother. She was the moral center of his universe, the one person whose opinion could make him question everything he'd built. While her son constructed an empire in the shadows, she worked as a seamstress, attended Mount Olivet Baptist Church every Sunday, and never took a penny of what she called dirty money. She paid her rent on time, kept her apartment immaculate, and treated every neighbor with the same quiet dignity she'd learned as a young woman in the South. Her eviction wasn't just a personal attack. It was an assault on everything decent and honorable that Bumpy fought to protect. Theodore Whitman owned 17 buildings in Harlem, inherited from his father who'd bought them cheap during the Depression. But Theodore wasn't continuing his father's business. He was perfecting it. Where his father had been cruel from greed, Theodore was cruel from conviction. He genuinely believed black families needed management with an iron fist, that any show of compassion would be interpreted as weakness that could destroy his entire operation. Whitman had developed his 3-strike system. First strike, tenant asks for repairs. Second strike, they ask again. Third strike, eviction regardless of payment history. He kept meticulous records of every complaint, every request, every sign of what he termed tenant assertiveness. His filing cabinets documented his tenants' lives in obsessive detail, tracking family income, work schedules, even which children attended school regularly. What made Whitman different was his systematic psychological warfare. He would schedule building maintenance during Sunday church hours, knowing it disrupted the one-day tenants had for themselves. He would raise rents by exactly the amount families saved for Christmas or school clothes. He studied vulnerabilities like a general studying enemy positions, understanding that poverty wasn't just about money, it was about crushing hope. The conversation that sealed his fate had taken place in Whitman's office on Amsterdam Avenue, 3 days before the eviction. Mrs. Johnson, wearing her best Sunday dress and carrying herself with the quiet authority of a woman who'd raised 8 children, had knocked politely on his door. She'd explained that the radiator in her apartment hadn't worked in 2 weeks, that she was an elderly woman living alone, that she'd been a model tenant for 15 years who'd never missed a rent payment or caused any disturbance. Whitman had listened without looking up from his newspaper. When she finished, he'd set the paper down and stared at her with the kind of cold contempt reserved for people he considered beneath him. You don't like the heat? Find somewhere else to live. I've got a waiting list of families who won't complain. Mrs. Johnson had straightened her shoulders, drawing on the same strength that had carried her through decades of hardship. Mr. Whitman, I'm not complaining. I'm asking you to fix what's broken. That's your responsibility as a landlord. Those words, your responsibility, had triggered something primal in Whitman. The idea that this black woman could stand in his office and tell him about his responsibilities had filled him with a rage that went beyond rational business decisions. In his twisted worldview, the entire social order depended on maintaining clear hierarchies, and Mrs. Johnson's quiet dignity represented a fundamental threat to everything he believed about how the world should work.
Get out, he'd said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. You've got 3 days. But what Whitman didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Mrs. Johnson's youngest son wasn't just another Harlem street hustler. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson controlled more of uptown Manhattan than any politician, police captain, or federal agent. More importantly, he operated by a code that put family above everything else, and anyone who threatened his family had just declared war on the most dangerous man in New York City. The call came to Bumpy at Jocko's bar on 145th Street at 2:17 in the afternoon. His mother's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was crying so hard she could barely speak. They put her out, Bumpy. They put your mama out on the street like she was nothing. All her things, everything, just sitting there in the rain. Bumpy Johnson set down his drink and walked out of that bar without saying a word. When he arrived at 135th Street, he found his mother sitting on a neighbor's stoop, still wearing her coat, staring at her scattered possessions with the kind of dignity that comes from accepting the unacceptable. She looked up when she saw him, and for the first time in his adult life, Bumpy saw something in his mother's eyes that made his blood run cold. Not anger, not fear, resignation. Mama, he said softly, kneeling beside her. Don't you do nothing foolish, boy, she said, her voice steady despite everything. This ain't worth getting yourself in trouble. But as Bumpy looked at his mother sitting on that stoop, as he saw her life reduced to wet boxes and broken furniture, something crystallized in his mind. This wasn't about trouble. This was about teaching Harlem a lesson it would never forget. Bumpy spent the next 3 hours moving his mother into a beautiful apartment on Strivers Row, the kind of place she'd never allow herself to live in before. He paid 6 months' rent in advance, arranged for all new furniture, and made sure she had everything she needed. But as he kissed her goodnight, Mrs. Johnson could see something in her son's eyes that worried her deeply. "Promise me you won't hurt that man," she said. "I promise, Mama," Bumpy replied. And he meant it. He had no intention of hurting Theodore Whitman. He was going to destroy him completely, systematically, and publicly. What happened over the next 6 months wasn't violence. It was systematic dismantling. Bumpy Johnson had learned long ago that the most effective way to defeat an enemy wasn't to attack them directly. It was to make their world uninhabitable. But this case was different. This was personal. And when Bumpy Johnson made something personal, he didn't just want to win. He wanted to educate every slumlord in New York City. That first night while his mother slept safely in her new apartment, Bumpy sat in his study with a yellow legal pad and began what he would later call architectural planning. He wasn't planning violence. He was planning a complete demolition, not of buildings, but of a man's entire existence. Bumpy understood that men like Whitman derive their strength not from their own capabilities, but from their position within systems designed to protect them. Remove the systems, and the man crumbled. But the key was patience and precision. Theodore Whitman woke up on November 10th to find that every single one of his tenants had received an envelope under their door. Inside was a detailed list of housing violations in their building, the city codes being broken, and the phone number for the housing authority. But more than that, each envelope contained something unprecedented, a copy of Whitman's own rental agreement, annotated with specific legal violations and tenant rights that most residents had never known existed. The envelopes weren't random. They had been personally delivered by Bumpy's network, numbers runners who knew every hallway, janitors who had keys to every building, shop owners who understood the rhythm of each block. By 7 a.m., before Whitman had even finished his morning coffee, his entire empire was waking up to the realization that they had rights, that their suffering wasn't inevitable, and that someone with power was finally paying attention.
By noon, Whitman had received 14 calls from city inspectors scheduling visits. But the calls kept coming. Not just from the city, but from the fire department, the health department, the buildings department, and agencies Whitman had never heard of. Each inspector found exactly what they were looking for because they knew exactly where to look. Someone had provided them with detailed maps of every violation, photographic evidence, and testimonials from tenants who were no longer afraid to speak. The inspections revealed what everyone already knew but no one had bothered to document. Faulty wiring that violated codes from 1923. Lead paint thick enough to poison 3 generations of children. Inadequate heat systems that hadn't been updated since the Coolidge administration. Rodent infestations that suggested the buildings were more habitable for rats than humans. Within 2 weeks, Whitman was facing $47,000 in fines and mandatory repairs. But that was just the opening move. Every contractor Whitman called to fix the violations suddenly became unavailable. Not busy, unavailable. The electricians who'd worked on his buildings for years stopped returning calls, claiming they'd found more profitable work elsewhere. The plumbers discovered mysterious scheduling conflicts that would last for months. The heating repair companies developed sudden concerns about payment reliability. Word had gone out through Harlem's underground network. Theodore Whitman was radioactive, and any business that helped him would find their own operations under unexpected scrutiny. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He'd studied Theodore Whitman like a chess master studying a particularly vulnerable opponent. Whitman had inherited buildings but also substantial debts. He'd been borrowing against properties to maintain his lifestyle, living beyond his means with no savings to weather any kind of financial crisis. December brought the final blow. Whitman's bank received an anonymous tip leading to an audit revealing he'd been inflating rental income on loan applications for years. Federal investigators arrived December 23rd with questions he couldn't answer and documents he couldn't explain. By February, Theodore Whitman was broke. Fines had accumulated to $73,000. Repairs were estimated at twice that. His tenants had won their class action lawsuit. The federal investigation had frozen his assets. Every attempt to fight back ran into the same invisible wall. On March 15, 1949, Theodore Whitman sat in his empty office, staring at foreclosure notices for all 17 buildings. He'd lost everything in less than 4 months. That's when the knock came. The man who walked in was well-dressed, soft-spoken, and completely unfamiliar. He introduced himself as James Mitchell, a representative of Harlem Real Estate Consortium. He had an offer to buy all 17 buildings, enough to pay off Whitman's debts and leave him with a few $1,000s to start over somewhere else. "Why would you want these buildings?" Whitman asked. "They're nothing but trouble. We specialize in troubled properties," Mitchell replied. "We have experience with community relations." Whitman signed the papers without reading them carefully. He just wanted out. It wasn't until 6 months later, when he was working as a clerk in a Philadelphia insurance office, that he learned the truth. James Mitchell didn't exist. The Harlem Real Estate Consortium was a shell company. The buildings were now owned by a trust that provided affordable housing for working families and maintained the properties to the highest standards. And every month, Mrs. Mamie Johnson received a check for $100 from an anonymous benefactor, enough to cover her rent and expenses with dignity. The money arrived like clockwork, accompanied by a simple note, "For a woman of grace who deserves to live with honor." The story of what happened to Theodore Whitman became Harlem legend, but not as revenge or street justice. People talked about it as proof that actions have consequences, that treating people with cruelty has a price, and sometimes that price comes in ways you never see coming. Whitman had learned the hard way that some people are connected to forces larger than themselves, and attacking the innocent can awaken powers that reshape entire neighborhoods. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about what happened to Theodore Whitman. When asked years later by a reporter about the incident, he simply said, "A man should take care of his responsibilities. When he doesn't, someone else will." Mrs. Mamie Johnson lived in her Strivers Row apartment for the rest of her life. She continued attending Mount Olivet Baptist Church every Sunday, continued treating every neighbor with dignity and respect, and never asked her son about what happened to the man who put her out on the street. She didn't need to ask. She could see it in the way other landlords treated their tenants, in the way city inspectors suddenly became very thorough in their building inspections, in the way working families found affordable housing in buildings that were maintained with pride. The 17 buildings that once belonged to Theodore Whitman became a model for community-owned housing in Harlem. The tenants formed a cooperative that maintained the properties, set fair rents, and ensured that no one was ever thrown onto the street for demanding basic human dignity. Theodore Whitman never returned to New York City. He never collected rent again. He lived the rest of his life in Philadelphia, working modest jobs and telling anyone who would listen about the importance of treating people with respect. Whether he understood exactly what had happened to him, or whether he simply learned to fear the consequences of cruelty, no one knows. What we do know is that Bumpy Johnson proved something that day when he found his mother on that stoop. Real power isn't about violence or intimidation. Real power is about having the patience to dismantle injustice piece by piece, the intelligence to turn a system against those who abuse it, and the wisdom to create something better from the ruins of what came before. The lesson of Theodore Whitman echoed through Harlem for decades. Slumlords who might have ignored tenant complaints suddenly became responsive. City officials who'd looked the other way started enforcing housing codes. Working families learned that when systems fail them, the systems can be rebuilt. Mrs. Mamie Johnson lived to see her neighborhood transformed from neglected tenements into a community where families lived with dignity. She watched children play in clean, safe hallways. She saw young mothers who didn't choose between heat and food. She witnessed elderly neighbors living without fear of arbitrary eviction. She never knew every detail of what her son had done, but she could see the results daily in her neighbors' faces, in the pride they took in their homes, in the knowledge that someone powerful watched out for them. She felt it in the respectful way landlords spoke to tenants, in prompt repairs, in the understanding that cruelty would have consequences. In the end, Theodore Whitman's greatest mistake wasn't just throwing an elderly woman from her home. His fundamental error was believing power was about what you could take from people rather than what you could build with them. The 17 buildings that once belonged to Whitman became proof of what was possible when a community decided to protect itself. The neighborhood learned that change was possible. And Harlem learned that sometimes justice comes not from courts or police, but from those who understand that true power lies in lifting people up rather than tearing them down. Years later, when young activists asked Bumpy Johnson how he'd accomplished such complete transformation without violence, his answer was always the same. You don't fight the system, you become the system, and then you make sure the system serves the people instead of serving itself.